Imagine waking up one morning and it's so cold inside your house that the water in the bucket beside your bed has frozen solid overnight. There's no thermostat to turn up, no electric blanket, no trip to the kitchen for a hot coffee, no heating app on your phone, just darkness, just cold. And the terrifying reality that if you don't do the right things, starting right now, you might not make it to spring. This wasn't a nightmare, this was just Tuesday for millions of ordinary people living in medieval Europe. And yet, they survived, generation after generation, through some of the coldest winters in recorded history, without a single piece of modern technology. So today, we're going to find out exactly how they did it, because the answer is far more fascinating and far more brutal than most people realize. To understand how medieval people survived winter, you first have to understand how completely it dominated their world. For the peasants and farmers who made up the vast majority of medieval society, roughly 90% of the population, the entire year revolved around one single question: will we have enough food, warmth, and shelter to survive until spring? Everything they did from the moment the first harvest was in, usually late September or October, was preparation for what was coming. Because winter in medieval Europe was not the mild, inconvenient thing many of us experience today. We're talking about the period historians call the medieval warm period, and later the Little Ice Age, a stretch of centuries where average temperatures across Europe were significantly lower than they are now. Rivers froze, crops failed, entire villages were buried in snowfall. The Thames in London froze so completely that people held fairs on top of it, called frost fairs, roasting oxen on the ice. And for ordinary people, a single bad winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was potentially fatal. So they developed systems, strategies, ancient knowledge passed down through generations, and honestly, some of it is brilliant. Let's start with shelter, because this is where everything began. Medieval peasant homes look primitive from the outside, and by our standards they were. A typical peasant house in 12th or 13th century England was a single-room structure called a longhouse, low ceilings, thick walls made of wattle and daub. That's a mix of woven sticks packed with mud, clay, and sometimes animal dung. And here's the thing, that design wasn't accidental. It was genius. Thick mud walls are actually excellent insulators. They absorb heat during the day and slowly release it at night. The same principle that modern architects call thermal mass, and it's being studied today as a sustainable building technique. The roof was almost always thatched, thick layers of dried straw or reeds packed so tightly that rain, wind, and cold struggled to get through. A well-made thatched roof could last 30 years, and the dense layers trapped air like a natural insulating blanket. Windows were tiny, sometimes just narrow slits covered with animal hide or wooden shutters. Not because medieval people didn't like light, but because glass was expensive and gaps in walls meant cold air. The smaller the opening, the warmer the room. And then there was the central hearth. No chimney in earlier medieval homes, just a fire burning in the middle of the earthen floor, with smoke drifting up and out through a hole in the roof. It sounds terrible, and in some ways it was. Medieval people suffered chronic lung problems from a lifetime of inhaling smoke indoors. But the fire served multiple purposes simultaneously. It heated the space, it cooked the food, it dried wet clothing, and the smoke actually saturated the thatch above, helping to preserve it and repel insects and rot. Later medieval homes, particularly from the 13th century onwards, began incorporating proper chimneys and fireplaces built into the wall, a significant upgrade. But even the primitive central hearth kept families alive for centuries. Here's something most people don't know about medieval winter life. In many parts of Europe, the family's animals didn't live outside during winter. They lived with the family. The longhouse design was often split, people on one end, livestock on the other. Cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, all sheltered under the same roof. And while that sounds unhygienic by modern standards, because it absolutely was, it was also a remarkably effective survival strategy. A single cow generates roughly the same heat as a small electric space heater, running continuously, for free. Pack several animals into the other end of your house, and you've added meaningful warmth to the entire structure. The animals benefited from shelter. The family benefited from heat. It was a mutually dependent relationship that kept both alive. The animals also meant milk in winter, a critical source of nutrition when everything else was scarce. Chickens provided eggs, and every animal represented a potential emergency food source if things got truly desperate. But here's the harsh reality. Not everyone made it through winter with their full herd intact. By the time spring arrived, many peasant families had been forced to slaughter animals they'd planned to keep, just to eat. Rebuilding the herd every spring was a constant, exhausting cycle. Now we come to food, arguably the most important part. Because in medieval winter, food wasn't just sustenance, it was survival currency. And the challenge was enormous. There were no shops to restock, no deliveries, no imports from warmer countries. What you had in October was what you had until April. So medieval people became masters of food preservation, and some of their techniques are genuinely remarkable. Salting was the most critical method. Salt draws moisture out of food, preventing bacterial growth. Meat, especially pork, was packed into barrels of salt and stored in cool cellars. A family that had salted enough meat going into winter had real security. A family that hadn't did not. Pigs were specifically valued because almost every part was edible and could be preserved. Medieval people had a saying, "Everything but the squeal." The slaughter of a pig in late autumn, sometimes called Martinmas, around November 11th, was practically a community celebration. Smoking was another key technique. Hanging meat or fish over a slow fire for days infused it with compounds that inhibited bacteria, while also drying it out. Smoked eel, smoked herring, smoked pork. These were winter staples for many communities. Root vegetables were stored in underground pits or cellars, packed in straw or sand to insulate them from freezing. Turnips, parsnips, and onions could last months this way. Apples and pears were dried or pressed into cider. Legumes, peas and beans, were dried and stored in sacks. They were arguably the most important winter food for peasants, providing protein and calories in a season where both were desperately scarce. And then there was pottage. If medieval peasant life had an official dish, it was pottage. A thick, slow-cooked stew made from whatever was available: dried peas, beans, onions, root vegetables, scraps of salted meat if you had them, herbs, grain. It simmered over the fire constantly, sometimes for days at a time, being topped up as ingredients were added. It wasn't glamorous, but it was warm, calorie-dense, and it kept people alive through months of brutal cold. The wealthy, of course, ate very differently. Noble households had access to spiced wines, imported dried fruits, preserved game, and elaborate feasts. Winter for them was a time of feasting and celebration. Christmas and the 12 days following it were a season of genuine abundance for those at the top of the social order. But for the majority of the population, winter eating was monotonous, calorie-focused, and driven entirely by what had been stored in autumn. Medieval people didn't have specialist outdoor gear. What they had was wool. And wool, it turns out, is one of the best natural insulating materials that exists. The basic principle of medieval winter clothing was layering. A linen undergarment sat directly against the skin. Over that went a woolen tunic. Over that, a heavier woolen cloak. Wealthy individuals added fur lining, sable, fox, and ermine for the nobility, sheepskin and rabbit for those lower down. Wool has a remarkable property that modern synthetic fabrics still struggle to fully replicate. It retains warmth even when wet. A waterlogged wool cloak is heavy and uncomfortable, but it still insulates. Cotton, by contrast, becomes dangerously cold when soaked. For the feet, the most vulnerable part of the body in cold, wet conditions, medieval people wore wool stockings and leather shoes, sometimes stuffed with straw or wool for additional insulation. Wealthier people had proper leather boots. Peasants often wore wooden pattens over their shoes, raised wooden platforms that kept feet above the mud and snow. Hats were essential. Medieval people understood, even without modern physiology, that you lost enormous amounts of body heat through an uncovered head. Wool hoods, linen coifs, fur-trimmed hats for the wealthy. Covering the head was non-negotiable in winter. Gloves and mittens existed, though they were luxury items for many. Poorer people wrapped their hands in strips of cloth. Some accounts mention peasants rubbing their hands with animal fat to create a watertight, insulating barrier against the cold, a technique used in some Arctic communities even today. Here's the survival strategy that modern people almost never talk about when they discuss medieval winter, and it might be the most important one of all. Community. Medieval people did not survive winter alone. The isolated individual in a medieval winter was a dead individual. Survival was collective, and it operated on multiple levels. At the village level, resources were shared in ways that are almost foreign to modern individualistic society. Communal grain stores, managed by the lord or the church, provided a safety net for families whose own stores ran low. The tithe barn, where a tenth of every harvest was stored, was a form of community insurance. Communal ovens meant that multiple families shared fuel costs for baking. You couldn't afford to heat a large oven every day, but if 8 families took turns using the same oven, the fuel cost became manageable for everyone. And at the social level, winter was ironically one of the most socially intense seasons because people clustered together for warmth. Long winter evenings were spent with neighbors, storytelling, mending tools and clothing, spinning wool, singing, not just for entertainment, but because more bodies in a room meant more warmth. The church also played a critical role. Beyond the spiritual, and medieval people genuinely believed God's favor was essential for surviving another winter. The church calendar structured winter with a series of feast days and celebrations that broke the psychological monotony of dark, cold months. Christmas itself was not a single day in medieval culture. It was 12 days of feasting, celebration, and communal activity, running from December 25th to January 6th. For people facing months of monotony, cold, and uncertainty, these celebrations were psychologically vital. We should be honest about something. Not everyone made it. The medieval period was not romantic, it was brutal, and winter was when the brutal truth of that world was most visible. Infant mortality in winter was catastrophic. Babies and young children were desperately vulnerable to cold and the infections that came with it. Elderly people frequently didn't survive from one winter to the next. The sick and weakened were most at risk in the coldest months. Famine years, when a bad harvest collided with a hard winter, could be catastrophic. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed an estimated 10 to 25% of the population of Northern Europe. People ate cats, dogs, bark. There are historical accounts, difficult to read, of much worse. Even in ordinary winters, malnutrition was common by February and March, the period sometimes called the hunger gap, when stored food was running low, but no new crops had yet grown. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a genuine winter threat, and yet, The vast majority of people found ways to persist, to adapt, to survive through another season, year after year, century after century. Medieval winter survival wasn't magic, it wasn't luck. It was knowledge, carefully accumulated, passed down through generations, refined over centuries. Know your shelter, know your food, know your community. Prepare in autumn for what is coming in winter. These people lived without anything we consider essential today. No electricity, no central heating, no supermarkets, no internet to check the forecast, no hospitals within reach. And they made it. There's something quietly remarkable about that. In a world that feels increasingly fragile and dependent on complex systems, the medieval peasant staring down a hard winter had something we've largely lost: the knowledge of exactly what they needed to survive, and the community around them willing to help them do it. If you found this video interesting, subscribe, because we're going deep into the forgotten details of how ordinary people lived through history. Not kings, not battles, just real people surviving real life.